second century science.
So this is for the Q&A. Can I explain the theory like it's a real theory? I'll explain it like you're a 6-year-old. So astrology and medicine are more closely related than astrology and astronomy are. So while astrology is developing from the pre-Christian era to the Middle Ages, it's developing in tandem with medicine. It's seen very much as part of the understanding of the human condition. It's a bit like psychology is now. But psychology isn't the successor of astrology because psychology is not about consciousness. It's essentially the natural science response to what consciousness is, but it's not the successor to astrology. So what is the theory of astrology? First and foremost, astrology was abandoned by academia. And when a subject's abandoned by academia, it's left to rot on the vine. And so while astronomy was taken into academia and given the opportunity to get patronage, which became funding, the Enlightenment took over everything. Ideas took a turning at the lights. And we were left with a different kind of scientific understanding of the world. So that's what the Enlightenment was. So those decisions were made in the 1600s. And the impact of those decisions is that no money went to alchemy, for example. That's not a problem because we got chemistry out of it. I agree with that. But we didn't lose astrology and get astronomy. We lost astrology and got psychology eventually. So we lost something. We lost the study of consciousness and we never got it back. Astrology is not about events in nature. It doesn't compete with physics. It's in its own domain. And we see it as either divination or pseudoscience or proto-science. But actually, it was about consciousness. And that's something we haven't solved with Enlightenment science. And we didn't solve it because we lost it. And we lost it because we didn't invest in it. And we didn't invest in it because patronage didn't come along. No research came along. And so the assumptions we make about astrology that we are making now were first made in the 1600s. We haven't developed anything since then. So your assumptions about what astrology is are based on what someone told you. And you have faith in the fact that they've done the research. Well, they haven't. It's almost 0 hours per century of research. Because there were 120 billion hours of research in physics and more in medicine every century, you're looking at the equivalent of 0 hours per century in astrology. So there is none. And so we shouldn't claim that there is. So no one's done any work to find out whether astrology is true or not. But there's so much commentary on the work that has been done. Silly experiments about trying to get astrologers to recognize which birth chart belongs to which person. Stupid, utterly stupid experiments like that. Because we've already lost the subject hundreds of years ago, and by not investing in it, we don't understand it. So we lost it in 1666, and we're asking in 1976 if astrologers know what they're doing? Of course they don't. It's the same as asking a medical practitioner from 1666 whether or not it still works in 1976 when you do bloodletting. But when you develop a subject, it turns into something else. It evolves, and astrology stops in 1666. Its evolution stops, but that doesn't make it untrue. What makes it untrue is the assumption that it can't possibly be true, and that comes from natural science, not from the science of consciousness or the ideas about consciousness or simulations. It comes from the ideas of natural science, and so we don't know the answer to that, or rather the people who pretend to know don't know the answers, but they make assumptions associated with what they believe, and that's quite crucial. Now there was someone, Carl Jung, came along in the early part of the last century, and he did understand astrology may have had a role to play, because he looked at moments in time and he looked at the qualities and the characteristics of moments in time. And again, Arthur M. Young, the inventor of the Bell helicopter, he did something similar with, as far as secondary progressions was concerned, he thought, these really work, but how do I show that? And he never got to the point where he could actually show it. So I'm saying it in really simple terms. Astrology isn't what you thought it was. It's not divination, it's the science of consciousness. Because we live in a simulation. The way to understand how that works is to follow the demarcation points of time in the system points you're in. And that's planets, from our point of view. In our matrix, that's the point of view that we're in. So planets are important, but signs aren't. The second part of the theory is that horoscopes aren't fixed, they move. So if you think your horoscope, you're an Aries or a Scorpio or whatever, That's not correct. It will change, and it changes at the rate of a day for a year, and it continues for 120 days. And I say 120 days because if a day equals a year, and the limit of human life at the moment is 120 years, that means it basically progresses for 4 months, and then beyond that it's not relevant anymore as far as we know. If we extend human life beyond 120 days, 120 years rather, we'll extend progress charts beyond 120 days. Another thing that the theory of astrology suggests is that horoscopes of the future won't be two-dimensional pages with charts on them. They'll be like virtual rooms you walk through. So effectively a tunnel. And that tunnel will depict your life, and you'll have you'll input different inputs, and outcomes will be shown to you. Possible outcomes will be shown to you. Now, this is not possible necessarily now, but it's the natural progression of what horoscopes are, which is multidimensional objects, not fixed and static two-dimensional objects. They're not fixed. They move, they change. And so horoscopes of the future will be very different from horoscopes of today. So the theory of astrology is that astrology was abandoned. We have made many assumptions about whether or not it could work or not, and those assumptions have been carried forward through time. And it's been depicted as a pseudoscience, but we haven't done the work to define whether or not it is. Remember, medicine took 130 years to develop anything at all, and 209 years to develop germ theory. And technically, medicine did have access to funding and patronage, so someone could have done the work. Astrology didn't. So while medicine took over 200 years to get rid of bloodletting, which is based on astrology, essentially, astrology has never had any opportunity to get rid of any of its errors. So as far as this particular answer to this question is concerned, horoscopes move, they change, they move at a rate for a day for a year, they're not fixed and static. We can make predictions based on cohorts when we look at certain conditions and certain events in the lives of those cohorts. We can make scientific predictions about what will show up. And at the moment, the scientific prediction is that in cohorts of people in relationships that are not forced relationships, we will see more Sun-Venus trines, conjunctions and oppositions than we would expect to see through chance, or if these were non-relationships. The next question is, why a day for a year? Well, simply because we have experimented with that fractal. There have been some other fractals that were available for experimentation, starting with what's called primary directions. So they were given to us by Ptolemy. And there are others named tertiary and minor progressions, and there are also directions called solar arc directions. And we have done experimentations with some of those, and what we've been able to show is that secondary progressions give us a concrete way of saying that we can progress a chart, we can move a chart through time using secondary progressions. We haven't yet been able to establish whether we can do it with tertiary, minor, solar arc directions or primary directions, but we can do it with secondary progressions. So that's why it's a day for a year. So if you're asking the question of why would it be designed as a day for a year, well, we have a year is essentially the movement around the sun of the Earth, one full circle around the sun, or ellipse, and a day is a rotation of the planet. So these are natural occurrences. They won't always be uniform, but at this moment in the history of consciousness, they are. It's 364.25 days and 24 hours. So what we're doing is we're taking a fractal and we're treating it as the larger measure. So we're using a natural fractal, a day, and treating it as a natural larger fractal, a year. Now there is a case for a month a week, some other increment, but we haven't been able to show anything associated with those increments yet. There's also other ways of doing this. You can do it back in time, so you can do before the birth. I've not been able to come up with any demonstration that any of that is true, but I have been able to demonstrate that secondary progressions do appear to be true. The next question is, why hasn't anyone else come up with this? Well, they didn't do the work. Plus there's no research tradition in astrology. It's not a research subject. It's assumed that the older an idea is in astrology, the truer it is, especially among horary and medieval astrologers, who will criticise psychological astrologers and modern astrologers by saying, well, there's no tradition there, so if there's no tradition there can't be any truth, or it's likely that there's less truth. That, I think, is just a silly idea, but who am I to say? But if you want to know why I came up with this and no one else did, it's because I did the work. Next question is, does this apply to gay relationships? And the answer is yes, it does. I'll do an episode on that. I've got plenty of data to show that it does apply exactly the same to gay relationships. There is no astrological demarcation about attraction to same gender as there is to opposite gender, or whatever we want to describe it as these days. So yes, absolutely. Gay relationships show up exactly the same way as straight relationships. Next question is about inaccurate information. Could my data be wrong and show up the result? Well, technically, if I hadn't done a control group, yeah, but we've created deliberately wrong data to see whether or not that creates a difference, and it doesn't. It creates a flat line. So the idea that wrong data could be the cause of the peaks and the troughs in the data is not tenable. Next question is, could there be a natural explanation for the number of trines, conjunctions and oppositions we are seeing? No. There is no natural mechanism to make people's charts in different relationships show up more often for just Sun Venus and Sun Venus trines, conjunctions and oppositions, and Venus Mars trines, and actually some Venus trines as well. I haven't showed you those yet, but yeah, there is no mechanism. But if there was, I probably would be eligible for a Nobel Prize. And to be honest, when the skeptics were looking at my data, they actually suggested this, but they didn't put me forward for the Nobel Prize, which kind of suggests that they didn't really believe what they were saying. Number of people suggested biased selection, even though I've described the criminal groups analysis that I do. So what I'll do now is show you the numbers associated with this so that you can see that there is no biased sampling. So if we look at the number of relationships that we looked at where at least one of the people in the relationship is in two or more relationships, these are the numbers, and this is the calculation associated with that. So that was in 1, 5, 5, 8 relationships. So we're looking at, and the global chi-square value is huge. And if we look at the set where each relationship, where neither partner is in more than one relationship, we find 1,042 relationships, and we still have significance in that. but we have greater significance in the cohort where they can't possibly have been selected. So no, there's no biased selection of data. That is you're barking up the wrong tree if you think that's the reason why. But there's only a few ways I can demonstrate that, and this is probably one of the best ways of demonstrating that. To say that in the cohort that couldn't possibly be a biased data set, the significance is higher than in the cohort that could have been a biased data set. Next one's an astrological question, and it's essentially could there be an excess of progressed Sun-Venus trines because you've already got an excess of natal Sun-Venus trines? Well, I did a test to see whether or not this was possible. And probably the most important thing to remember here is that the progression doesn't begin until the birth of the younger person in the relationship. So therefore, the natal aspect isn't developing like that. It develops like that in a progression. And then, so basically, they're not together at the beginning. They're together when the younger person is born, and then they progress like this. They don't progress like this. So I tested it to see whether or not there were any that fitted that criteria, and there are 4 out of hundreds. 4 fit that criteria. So that doesn't wash either. Anyway, there we are. So questions come to progressedsynastry, all one word, at gmail.com. And you can like, you can follow, you can subscribe, or you can hate. I'm not precious. Tune in next week, where we'll be talking about how astrology is not what you think it is.
It's still in the game. Somebody's pulling your chain. About 22nd century science.